All right, today we're talking about the higher order question grid, and I know that the three of you have used the higher order question grid with students in your classrooms. So I guess one of the first questions I would ask you is, how did you introduce this thing to your students? It just seems a little difficult.
Well, the first thing I did was I had an interactive notebook for reading, and so I have them cut it out and color code it because it's easier for them to grasp when they see that quadrant 1 is 1 point, these are 2, and the last one is 3 points. And so I had them color code them different colors. And then we spent quite a while on this because they have to get used to it, just like I had to get used to it, because they tend to look at, well, let's look at who, and let's look at number 3, wouldn't. They want to put those together, and they don't necessarily always make sense, or who might not. It doesn't necessarily make sense. So I had to get them out of that mindset of putting those two words together, whereas, they could be anywhere in that sentence, and it's still a number 3, or it's still a number 2. Once we got past that point, then I used a tree map and labeled 1, 2, and 3. And I cut questions out of various texts from wherever I found them. And I had them work in partner pairs. And they had to look at the question, they had highlighters, and they had to highlight if it was what and might. And then together they had to sit down and discuss, well, what do you think that was? Was that a number 1 or a number 2? And how do you know that? And that eased the way into going even deeper with it.
So first they were analyzing other people's questions
Right.
instead of writing their own questions
Yes.
at first.
And before we get too far on that, a friend of mine who teaches the lower grade, she teaches 2nd grade, she actually heard your idea and took it a step further and made it for a 2nd grader. And she blew up the chart and put it in her center and used colors, and they put the colors in an envelope, and the children pulled out a color and they had to match it up with the words. And so she did that in 2nd grade.
It's nice when you can hear an idea and move it to different grade levels, down to K. I know of some kindergarten teachers that as they introduced it to their students for the first time, they were into that, the I do, we do, you do. So she was using it by herself first, but then when she started using it with the students, she had it also hanging up a larger version, and as they would go through trying to say, okay, this matched with, that, and okay, and then ask that question, and then they'd check it off like a bingo game, kind of filling in the squares as they together generated questions from text. And, one student in the classroom would generate a question, and others would create the answers.
As Camille mentioned, I had to get used to using the grid before I could use it with the children, so I kept it like Becky did at my guided reading table, and I introduced it to them. I modeled it in my guided reading for a few weeks just to get myself used to it and get them used to seeing how it's used. So that's how I introduced it in guided reading.
While I had it in the guided reading, I didn't share with them what I was doing. And after a couple of weeks, they wanted to know, why are you using that? And then I was able to explain it to them, and then they said, oh, okay, because they were still wanting those, what's the main idea, what's going to happen next, and they wanted it to be very simple and very rote, and they realized that, oh, okay, this is where she's going with all of this. And then when I introduced it to them on the smart board and put it in the center, they were able to relate to what we had already done, and then had them start working with it and writing their own questions.
They weren't strangers to
Right,
it.
right.
Yeah, not being a stranger to it is important,
Mhm.
And hey, if my teacher's using it, I can use this too. So let's talk about use in the classroom. What other ways did you use this grid, or the students? Now, we've talked about introducing it, but how did they use it? Did they use it on a weekly basis, a daily basis, once a month? Do you just ask questions, or?
Well, I spend quite a few weeks on like one certain story, and my children are sitting in Kagan groups, cooperative groups, and what we did was everybody in the group made a question, and then in the group they discussed it, and then in the group they decided which one was the highest points, and they to present to the classroom. So they picked one question from the 4 questions, and then they presented it to the class, where we put them on chart papers and had them hanging up, and eventually it became their quiz for the story.
Oh, so they wrote their own quiz for
They
the
wrote
story.
their own quiz.
And they all wrote 1-point questions, right?
And no,
No.
in the beginning, but after they got used to it, the questions got more open-ended, and they used the words like wouldn't and couldn't and shouldn't instead of just what is Joe's name, where did Joe's name come from, or it got better as the year went on. Took
Well,
some
and they
time.
start to see the value in being able to challenge each other. The
And-
fact that they were doing that without you sitting there.
And even the lowest children could contribute and use some part of their question as their question that they presented to the class. So everybody got to participate using the grid.
Becky, what else? Did you?
I used it with, in January, I had the opportunity to start introducing novels, units of study, and we put it into the centers, and I had it projected up on the board, and they knew that they were going to have to write questions. We did 2 to 3 chapters, depending on the book, a day, and we'd read one together, and then have to independently read 1 or 2, and then when they got to the center where they had the question grid, they were going to have to write questions as a whole group. I didn't have them do it individually, and kind of figure out their points, and then the next group would come along and they'd look at those questions. They were posted in a pocket chart, and the next group would come along and they'd try to figure out their points, and then they'd write their questions, and then this would take the first week, and then the second week they're reviewing this book the whole time, and they'd go back and they'd have to answer each other's questions. And they were always trying to beat each other with points. I didn't give them, I wanted a minimum of 5 questions, but it wasn't mandatory. I was hoping to get to that point. And I had one little boy who did very little talking in the room, but was very bright. And the other kids were always trying to get to his level of question, which it was wonderful that he was able to contribute without having to verbalize, because it was just very difficult for him. And then he was so proud of himself when they would choose his question as the best question, or I would choose it for them as a review question before they took the AR test. And I found that their AR scores, they went from my low kids not getting anything because they really hadn't read the book or listened to it, to going, and now they're passing the AR tests, and now they want to read chapter books. And it really gave them a depth of knowledge that I didn't expect the AR to improve so quickly, and was just so impressed with that piece of it. And it really wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be for them, but I think the fact that I just sat there for the first half of the year, and it was in my center. It was my guide, and they saw me using it, and then they went ahead and used it. And it was just, I love her ideas. I love what she did with it, and I hope to see more of that, because it really took it to another level.
So you saw the benefit of AR. What benefits did you see in your room as students used the grid?
They would sit there and, well, one thing I did was I did the text mapping strategy, because text features are a skill that they struggle on. And so I would always have a mission statement up there, and it would say, okay, so circle all the captions and put a square around bold, and we talk about the different text features that way. And you should see them. They were all on the floor. I had the social studies I'd all copied and pasted together, and there were the markers. And I wish I had taken a picture of them all on the floor.
I wish you did too.
And,
Yes.
and they had their question grid, and they're like, no, that's not a higher order thinking question. Look, you have when and is. We need over here, look over here in quadrant 3. So it was really interesting to see them, take ownership of it. I also would do little challenges in between. Well, okay, I know the number 1s are easy. we got that down. And number 2s, you're getting there. How about number 3? Let's try and give me 2 number 3s. And here's a challenge. I want you, one of your number 3 questions must come from a text feature. So whether it's the caption, or it's a bold text, or it's the glossary.
Oh my.
And so some of them came up with some really good questions. Like, they really put a lot of thought into it, and they surprised me. I was like, whoa, I wouldn't even think of that. Like, go you.
You know what I noticed from using the grid? They recognized higher order questions, like on the FCA. They were like, one of them actually came up to me and said, hey, this is a 3-pointer. And I was like, you're right, you noticed it. But they get to notice the benefit of knowing this grid. They pick it up and own it themselves just because they're familiar with it.
And piggybacking off of that, one kid said, I remember when we were doing the story mapping, they said, oh, well, so-and-so has question number 1. That's kind of like the main idea. Like, we're discussing her main idea. And then when you get into question 2, she's giving us details to support that. And then when you get into question 3, I mean, she's really got to be reading. And I was like,
Who are you and what do you do with my student?
Yeah, but that
So, I mean,
shows that you were a facilitator.
but they get it. I mean, it takes, in the beginning, you really have to get them used to it. But once they get
Takes
used
time.
to it, they will blow your minds.
The talk that goes on around it is just so amazing to listen to the children and what they come up with instead of you telling them what to say or the answers right there in front of you. What you talked about there with it, just listening to them, it's putting them into that learner position versus that student. And it just, it really takes them where we want them to go. And when you said something about the FCATs, I thought, okay, well maybe that's why when we got to where they were writing these questions, those long answers on the back that we wrote,
The FCAs,
the FCAs, yes, those questions, the answers got better after they started writing questions.
Exactly.
They started looking deeper into the story because a lot of those questions are in the higher order
That's right.
realm, and it was just, it really, really tied the whole text together for them by writing their own questions.
Well, and we've talked a lot about them writing their own questions or generating questions. Do you make them answer those questions and other people's questions too?
Yes.
I mean, it's
And
not
it's-
just a question generator, it's
Right.
being able to answer those and support those.
Right.
Is-
And I have like a question starter that they have in their notebook in their reference section, and it says, as stated in the passage, or on page so-and-so,
That's
so-and-so
keywords
said,
like that?
and it's all there. So even if they don't remember, they can flip back and be like, okay, these are my question starters. These will help me to answer the question.
Yeah.
So they got used to that as well.
And by me posting them on the chart paper and leaving them up to the entire story, when we did take the quiz, they had already seen those questions like for a couple of weeks before we actually went and answered them for a quiz grade. So it was like constantly exposed to it.
So if you were to, and I didn't tell you about this question, if you were to say to someone else, benefit or why should other teachers use this? How did it help the most, or what advice would you give to somebody with this?
Common Core is where the teacher is more the facilitator than standing and doing instruction all the time. So I think that this grid helps you release the control a little bit, where the kids are more in tune to the story because they're making the questions. So you're sitting and you're watching them make these questions, and you're more than you standing in making them for them, or so they take ownership of it using the grid. So it's more of a Common Core thing because it's open-ended.
And you get some good discussions with the questions. You really do. And using the evidence, I have them speak it as well, not just write it. Well, is so-and-so answering that question the way we should answer it? No, because they didn't use an evidence starter. So and so should say on page 19 and back it up. So, yeah.
And as everybody begins to use this in the Common Core, you're going to see, I think you'll see the benefits in the upper grades where you're at, and you're just introducing it to your 4th and 5th graders as it being used more in the kindergarten rooms in the 1st and 2nd.
Even if
as
it's
we share.
introduced with colors in
Right.
the lower
Yeah.
grades, you know, eventually you'll
Is
let
that
those
concept
colors
is there.
go, and they'll associate the color with the words.
And it can be used across the curriculum. It's not just when we were doing the math training. A lot of this, that open-ended question and letting them explore and letting them ask questions to each other and how did you get that answer? Well, prove it to me. And just that if you're starting that discussion in reading and in math, and it's going to come into the science, and you hopefully we'll see them saying, "Oh, well, that's a 3-point question."
But I feel some people watching this may say, this is too hard for my kids.
Oh, I've heard that before. Plenty, and that's where the cooperative pairs come in.
Where you have them work with each other and they're not intimidated because they have the words right in front of them. So if they work together and perhaps one will say, well, what if we try to go for where would you go, instead of just where did the character go. So one student is helping the other student, and you're still facilitating, you're still there to push them in that direction. So I feel it gives everybody a fair chance at contributing to the story and to the details.
And when they were, oh, sorry.
No, as far as the teachers go and the buy-in, my thinking is that if we plan cooperatively and we can bounce these ideas off of each other, it will make that a little bit easier. It's just sitting here and talking and listening to each other's ideas, and then, oh, I can take it that way, or I can do this. Her tree diagram idea, what a way to introduce it to the children and have them take other people's questions and rate them. Nobody in the classroom wrote them. There's no ownership of these, but yet there's ownership when they start putting them in that order, and that wasn't a whole lot of work for her. She didn't have to come up with questions on her own. And just sharing the ideas with each other, you have to work as a team to generate this and to get yourself into the comfort zone.
And I lost my train of thought, sorry.
It's okay. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to let the people taking the course write some questions on a piece of text we're going to give them. And I appreciate all of you being here and sharing your ideas and thoughts with our Moodle audience. Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
Thank